Okay, so this one is partly intended to be a follow-up to my video on non-crime hate incidents. I think that sort of thing is very concerning. I still think it would be premature and unhelpful hyperbole to say that this country is a police state. I mean, that would clearly be ridiculous. And I think it's actually insulting to people who've lived in actual police states like Eritrea, North Korea, and so on. There's just no comparison. Um, but that doesn't mean that these things should just be dismissed and go unchecked either. A big part of this comes down to the nature of policing. When Starmer was asked about it, he said it's down to the operational decisions of police forces, which is technically true. You know, a lot of the time it's Starmer's government that gets the blame, but for a long time now, including in the Conservative years, police forces have come under scrutiny for overreach. So I don't think this is necessarily something that can be blamed on political parties. A lot of this does come down to the decisions made by police superintendents, um, chief officers, and so on. So I want to talk about what I consider to be good policing versus what I consider to be bad policing, because very often these debates get into, are you for or anti-police? Well, I've always said that I am not anti-police because I believe in empowering good officers to do their job, to tackle crime and keep the public safe. And I've always said that it's not a job I envy. I think policing is difficult in any circumstances, particularly in metropolitan police forces like the Metropolitan Police, Greater Manchester, West Midlands, Police Scotland, and so on. In the case of Scotland, of course, it's all now one force as opposed to being regionalised. It's not easy. It's not an easy job. They face real dangers and they face a lot of criticism. I will say this, Flo, a lot of the criticism is self-induced. And it's not good enough for the police to say that the public should stop criticising us. They need to seriously introspect and understand where this criticism is coming from. Because honestly, the public see officers going to a journalist's house and telling her that she's committed a non-crime hate incident. It just doesn't inspire confidence. When people might justifiably say, well, wait a second, someone's been the victim of a burglary, officers don't turn up immediately, they may well take hours to turn up, if at all. You get this absolute epidemic right now of theft from small businesses. And I wonder, you know, a lot has been said of Lord Timpson's proposals on penal reform. And, you know, the left have hailed him. I'm not so convinced. This video wasn't so much about that. I may make another video on that subject. But two things. Firstly, it is not true that his approach hasn't been tried before. This idea that we just throw people in prison immediately, that is simply not true. And Lord Timpson knows that isn't true. In fact, there's many offenders that avoid prison time and time and time again. Now, can he seriously say that someone who is habitually shoplifting and constantly gets put on community service, can he honestly say that a non-custodial sentence is working in those cases? Clearly it isn't. And as imperfect as the British penal system is, and believe me, there's serious problems with it, but I do think it's fair to say most offenders, given a choice between a community sentence and prison, they're going to be more scared of prison, right? But anyway, I derail. This isn't about. That's for another video. On the issue of policing, I'm going to break this into two parts. I'm going to be focusing on the UK here because it'll muddy the waters if I try talking about other situations around the world. Thinking specifically of Britain, what I consider to be good policing, a big part of it is common sense. You know, I am very, very supportive of what I would call bread and butter police. That is, officers who simply want to apprehend criminals, people who are hurting the public. You know, officers who want to take on drug dealers, murderers in serious cases, but also teenage gang members who are harassing the public, antisocial behaviour. that sort of thing that can really degrade someone's life quality. Sexual offences, these sort of serious crimes. Police officers who dedicate time and resources to looking into this stuff, it can sometimes be very tedious work. It can be dangerous, but it can also be very tedious, long hours, lots of paperwork. But I have a lot of respect for officers who dedicate the work to this. And remember, police officers are not on wonderful pay. Um, so that needs to be remembered. I also think, in the case of the Metropolitan Police, particularly, they really are in a difficult position, for instance, when they're policing rallies, where you get, for example, say, anti capitalist demonstrators during a big summit. You get pro Palestinians, you get pro Israelis, you get, self described British patriots, you get pro immigration, you get anti immigration, you get all ranges of different causes going through the capital, and they are tasked with being impartial and policing it fairly. Do they always get it right? Certainly not. I do think there's a problem with two-tier policing, and I think it's ridiculous to say that's some sort of far-right invention. Police officers themselves, retired police officers, have said this is a real thing, and this idea that talking about it somehow puts officers' lives in danger is ridiculous. Officers are in a difficult job to begin with. So the idea that people criticising a model of policing puts their lives in danger seems ridiculous. These are people who face violent criminals all the time. That's far more dangerous to officers than criticising perceptions of double standards in policing. And there is legitimate ground for it. Um, One thing that came out of that report, I mentioned yesterday with Alison Pearson, was the fact that officers wouldn't pose with the Israeli flag. Fair enough. I don't actually think they should. But why then pose for the flag of a Pakistani political party? Things like that people do question. Um, I think the policing of the protests during the Israel-Gaza war have definitely led to a lot of questions. Um, Definitely, the policing of eco groups like Just Stop Oil has, for the most part, until recently, it's been utterly lax. Now, the good news is those groups are seriously, I think they have declined in influence, or less visible than they were before. But it was an utter disgrace that British Transport Police, literally offered them cups of tea, literally, when Insulate Britain was engaging in their stunts. The vast majority of the public do not agree with the tactics that those groups use, and they want to see the police enforcing the law. When you see them slow walking along the street and officers walking along slowly beside them, the reality is, if you had nationalist type demonstrators bringing out the Union Jack, the police would be swooping in there. I don't like Tommy Robinson, and I don't go along with those who think he's some sort of modern day Robin Hood type folk hero. I don't like the guy. I think he has a track record of lying, frankly, and inciting. I don't like the guy, but when he gets, a long custodial sentence for contempt of court, but you get someone like Hugh Edwards escaping a custodial sentence for prolific predatory behaviour, that does raise questions. Again, though, that's more for the judicial side of things. But all of this taps into a power and accountability of power. Um, there are times the police just lack common sense. For example, there was a woman on Coronation Day last year held for 8 hours because she was perceived to be maybe a Just Stop Oil protester, even when she had proven that she wasn't. She had no spray paint, she had no confetti, nothing that could be the sort of things that they would use. She was held for hours. The Met later blamed another force. They said it was Lincolnshire Police that done that. So there's a lack of accountability. I think officers engaging in racist and sexist posts in online threads have no business wearing the uniform. If they cannot be comfortable representing everyone, they're in the wrong job. That's not a trivial thing. When you get police officers joking about two women who've been murdered in a London park, they have no business wearing a uniform. I don't accept this argument, oh, it's just a joke or it's just banter or something. The public rightly expect a degree of professionalism and respect for victims of crime. And I do think that there's particularly a rotten problem in the Met with misogynistic attitudes. And it isn't just Wayne Couzens and David Carrick. With those officers, they were rotten apples, but there would have been people around them knowing what they were like and defending that behaviour. So good officers have to speak up, and if they don't, they can't complain about being tarred with the same brush. I think that whistleblowers within the police need to be protected. There needs to be a safe passage for them to say, look, I've seen my colleague doing this. I don't think it's appropriate for a police officer. So whistleblowers need to be protected. Um, there is a balancing act here, weeding out these people whilst also protecting good officers. Now, what we saw with the Chris Kaba case was officers who were protecting the public, and actually, it turned out Kaba was not an innocent man. He was a violent gang member. He was in a stolen vehicle, and actually, far from being unarmed, it has been shown by tragic incidents that vehicles can actually be used as a weapon. There was the officer who was dragged for several miles through Berkshire by two offenders and died, obviously. So cars can be used as a weapon. The Mayor of London disgracefully wouldn't apologise for condemning the police on that, and he openly, called for sympathy for Kaba's family. I think that whole case was quite illuminating, and it highlights the difficulty that police officers face. They have to be able to do their job without people yelling racist at them when they're arresting a minority suspect, for example. If they have information that says the suspect is 5'8", black, wearing a blue top, they're going to question someone who's black, 5'8", wearing a blue top. If the suspect is 6 foot, white, wearing a green top, they would stop that sort of person. That's just common sense. So I do believe that stop and search can save lives. And there's been many examples showing that. I think Sadiq Khan's Mayoralty of London has been far, far too much veering towards being against understanding the sort of situations that police face. Now, for sure, corrupt officers should be punished. I don't think it's good enough just to be kicked out of the force. I think they have to be punished. And if a police officer breaks the law, if they assault an innocent person, for example, they should be arrested for assault. Excuse me, that was just my alarm. So it's extremely important not to have double standards. I don't think the UK police, talking collectively here, is as bad as some parts of the world. I mean, I think American cops get away with far too much, to be quite honest. Um, but ultimately, a lot of this comes down to common sense. You can be pro-police, want officers to being able to do their job, but also insist that bad officers are held to account and punished and have no business wearing the uniform. But I think the public need to be understanding of the situation officers are in. Um, when the police get it wrong, they need to not only apologise, but show what they're going to do differently, such as the case of Andrew Malkinson, a man who, thanks to the incompetency of Greater Manchester Police, spent 17 years in prison for a crime he didn't commit. And they did apologise, but they need to go further and say what are they going to do to prevent that happening again. This thing of pressuring someone until they confess, wearing them down, instead of looking at other leads, that's really questionable. Um, Ultimately, policing is not an easy job, and they might say it's a thankless job. But I would say a lot of the stuff the police do are of their own making. When you get an officer, for example, questioning a musician who has just been harassed by Chinese nationalists and saying to him, "You can't say that," referring to the fact that he had said, I'm talking about the Brendan Kavanagh incident earlier this year, the fact that he had said, "Oh, this is Britain, not China," that is a completely legitimate thing to say. And the police officer in that case, she demonstrates the utter lack of common sense and the willingness to pander, frankly, to foreign sensitivities as well. It's very troubling. It's certainly not in her domain to tell people what they can and can't say unless they are actually violating any laws. So I do sometimes question where police are putting their priorities. The use of non-crime hate incidents, I think good officers should resist that. I think good officers should say, no, We want to be tackling burglars. We want to be tackling rioters. We want to be tackling muggers, not policing what people say on Twitter unless it is an explicit threat. So I think at the moment British policing has a bit of a crisis of common sense. I think there are good officers out there, but I think it's being overshadowed by stupidity, frankly, and the lack of common sense and abusing, for example, non-crime hate incident legislation. So I say to the police, I'm on your side. I want to enable, police to be able to do their job. I want that sort of situation from the government. But bad officers should be purged from the force. Those who are overtly misogynistic, racist, who have one infraction after another. Clearly, there's something going on there. There has to be a platform for whistleblowers, and there also has to be public understanding of the difficulty officers face, the dangers that they take, and sometimes having to make instantaneous decisions. Because sometimes we see headlines that on the surface looks like an abuse of power, and I think this is the case with the Chris Cabot incident. I freely admit my first reaction to that was, oh, it's awful, they've killed an unarmed man. It turned out there was more to that. So I think there needs to be public understanding of some of the situations that police face. But when officers abuse their position, they should be criticised. It isn't anti-police to insist that there is police accountability. I certainly would never propose the far left idea of defunding the police. I think that's stupid. What I would also like to see is a lot more police patrols on the streets. Um, Actual police, not community support officers who have little power. Actual police doing beats, Bobby's on the beat, back to basics. That is extremely important. To be fair to Greater Manchester Police, I mentioned them recently. More recently, they have been adopting, I believe the Chief Superintendent of Manchester Police has actively called for this, for more of a focus on back to basics policing. That has to be their priority. The public want to see the police being proactive. The public want the police to sympathise with victims of crime and take them seriously. Um, that means a hell of a lot less focus on things like non-crime hate incidents. Also, reassuring the public by getting rid of bad officers who have no business wearing a uniform. And the bad officer could be one who is abusing their power through holding bigotry towards one segment of the community, or it could be an officer that just lacks common sense. I think they're both forms of bad officer. One who abuses their power, but also one who lacks common sense and will harass members of the public over nothing. That's ridiculous. To all the good officers out there, I say thank you. I say thank you for putting yourselves on the front line and doing what you can to keep us safe. I am pro-police, but I do not support stupidity, and I do not support wasting resources on things on. Finally, this also applies to woke gestures. For example, spending thousands of pounds of public money on kitting out a police car in the pride flag. That isn't going to help gay victims of hate crime. Okay, that is the wrong priority.